Welcoming our guest and opening our program is Stephen Buchi, who is director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. Dr. Buchi served for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. He's also served as military assistant to Secretary Donald Rumsfeld for 5.5 years. Prior to joining us here, he was an IBM authority on cybersecurity policy, and he also is an adjunct professor of leadership at George Mason University. Please join me in welcoming Steve Buchi. Steve?
Okay, I'm going to do this very quickly so we can get to listen to Sean. We are here to discuss his newest book, The Secret History of Joint Special Operations Command, Relentless Strike. Sean, if you don't know him, has sort of specialized in special operations forces. He worked for Army Times, where that was kind of his beat. He was really the only guy around that specialized in that, didn't just pick it up at other times. He's also a contributing editor to Foreign Policy. He's basically followed JSOC at least since 9/11 and a little before that. He's also covered military operations in Somalia, Haiti, the Balkans, Afghanistan, Iraq. He goes to all the nice places in the world. But if you're going to follow SOF, that's where you have to go, because that's where they go. He has a previous book, Not a Good Day to Die, which is about Operation Anaconda, and just a ton of articles on all of this material. I was kind of excited when the book came out, because one of the first things I did when I came here to Heritage was to bump into Sean on the street outside, because he lives nearby here, and he said, well, let's get together. I want to talk to you about some of the stuff you did in your other life, particularly those last couple of years when I was on active duty working in the front office, which was right at the beginning of the war on terror. So he, I was interviewed as sort of a Forrest Gump kind of character, having been at the decision-making level, at least watching or taking notes on a lot of the things that are discussed in this book. I have to tell you, in my opinion, this is probably one of the most factually accurate depictions of JSOC you will find, both from the historical end and all the more recent activities. But I will tell you, it is not without controversy. I've had several people, when we set this up and put it up on our website, contact me and say, what the heck are you doing, Buchi? Why are you hosting this guy? And I said, well, because he's one of the most serious journalists out there writing about SOF. He knows what he's talking about. The controversy is, to be honest with you, maybe there's too much information in the book. Some people feel that. We'll let you listen to Sean, and then we can talk about it afterwards. And there's also the charge, which I just finished reading a book about Waterloo, and the Duke of Wellington had the comment that writing a story about military operations or battles is very difficult, if not impossible, to do accurately, because everybody who partakes in it has a very different take on what happened. So I know Sean has made the effort to talk to as many people as possible who are involved with the operations that he covers in this book, from the highest levels down to the operators and everything in between. I know him to be the kind of stand-up guy. He doesn't play gotcha. He's trying to find the truth and get it out there, because that's what journalists do. Those of us who do these things don't always like that, because there have been other things revealed that people are upset about. I think some of the blowback that he's getting on this book is a result not necessarily of what's in this book, but a result of sort of an attitudinal thing in Washington of talking a little too much about things. But journalists provide us with history, because we as Americans need to know what the heck goes on sometimes. After the fact is better than in the midst of it, and that's what Sean has done here, I believe. So I will turn it over to you, my friend, and then I'll come back up when we do the Q&A after you get done with your prepared remarks.
All right. Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Steve, and thank you all for giving up what, for a lot of you, I suspect is your lunch hour to to come and listen to me. I hope I can make it worth your while. It is a huge pleasure and an honor to be asked to speak to you on today of all days. I'd like to think that my book, amongst other things that it may represent, is a testament to the extraordinary men and women who have served for Joint Special Operations Command and the elite units that it controls. Those men and women have made extreme sacrifices, including all too often the ultimate sacrifice in the multiple campaigns waged against Islamist extremists during the past 14 years. So we should think about them today. It's appropriate as well, I think, to be speaking today because the attacks on September the 11th, 2001 marked a clear dividing line in the history of Joint Special Operations Command. Now, when I was putting my remarks together, I wasted about 2 hours last night drafting or attempting to draft sort of a talk that walked you through the major points in my book in a chronological fashion. I don't know what I was thinking. That was a fool's errand. I spent 3 years working on that book. It covers 30 years. Trying to cram it into 25 minutes wouldn't have been fun for me or for you. So I gave that up, and instead I thought I would talk around some themes and observations that emerged from immersing myself in the history of Joint Special Operations Command over the last 3 years, and that I would hope would also strike a close reader of the book. And in doing so, I can probably touch on a lot of the signal events in JSOC's history over, which is now 30 years old, because actually, beg your pardon, 35 years old at this point. One of those themes is that organizations don't always end up doing what they were originally created to do, and that is certainly the case with Joint Special Operations Command. JSOC, as it's known, was established in 1980 as a response to the failure earlier that year of Operation Eagle Claw, which was the Iran hostage rescue mission. That operation had been overseen by an ad hoc staff and conducted by units unused to working together. Defense policymakers understood that had to change if chances of success in future missions were to be maximized. And so, against the wishes of some of the senior military brass at the time, the Pentagon created JSOC as a headquarters to run future counter-terrorist missions. The new command soon gathered various special mission units, such as the Army's Delta Force, the Navy's SEAL Team 6, under it. But although JSOC was created for counter-terrorism missions, and there was a lot of terrorism in the 1980s, including numerous hostage-taking incidents in the Mediterranean, for which JSOC deployed, it always ended up as a case of so near yet so far for JSOC, which trained year-round to take down hijacked cruise liners in the case of SEAL Team 6, and in the case of Delta was continuously refining its ability to rescue hostages from buildings or hijacked airliners. In short, to my knowledge, in the first 20 years of its history, JSOC never got to put those specific skill sets to real-world use. Instead, in what would become a trend, when it did see action, it was not in the discrete counterterrorism missions for which it was created, but to spearhead larger operations against conventional opponents. For example, the 1983 invasion of Grenada, which was an error-strewn fiasco, and the 1989 invasion of Panama, which was much better planned and executed. This gets to another theme, which is that, or maybe an adjunct to the initial theme, which is that throughout its history, JSOC was asked to solve problems simply because it was viewed as a supremely capable organization, not because those problems were the sort of challenges that JSOC had been created to solve. That leads to another, another theme, which is that JSOC actually, and this is sort of a part of its history that's only understood, I think, by people who have focused very closely on it. Actually, although it was sort of created for hostage rescue, it was given in the early 1980s a counter weapons of mass destruction mission, the counter-proliferation mission, that really came to dominate its training and how it thought about itself for, I would argue, up to the 9/11 attacks. This is in some ways a case of follow the money. Talking to folks who served in the units and in the headquarters at that time, the amount of money that was flowing into JSOC that was specified to be used on the counter-proliferation missions was so great that that's how JSOC started to organize itself. This gets into another observation, which is that, and this is a military truism, that you train in the way that you intend to fight. Train as you fight. The flip side of that is that you fight as you've trained. JSOC, in the absence of any long-term sort of real-world military commitments, such as the command had in the post-9/11 era, focused a lot of its energy on quarterly training exercises called Joint Readiness exercises, or JRXs. And once the counter-proliferation mission became so important to JSOC, these exercises tended to focus on counter-proliferation, counter-weapons of mass destruction scenarios. Also, as JSOC was growing and acquiring new units, the desire on the part of the headquarters was to involve at least parts of every single one of those units in the exercises. So in addition to Delta Force, SEAL Team 6, an equivalent Air Force organization that went through a lot of name changes, eventually was called the 24th Special Tactics Squadron. The Army's 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, a variety of, and the 75th Ranger Regiment of the Army is sort of an elite airborne light infantry organization that eventually morphed into something significantly more than that. All of these organizations had to be involved in every training exercise. Every one of these quarterly training exercises. As a result, the JSOC modus operandi became less and less to become a sort of a nimble, quick to adapt, give us the mission and we'll take care of it in 12, 24, 36, 48 hours, to an organization that got used to flying a massive headquarters to wherever it had to go, setting up, flying large transport plane after large transport plane in, and it basically became quite an unwieldy an unwieldy organization in the view of many of the folks who were serving under it. Thus, on September the 11th, 2001, and this is how I start the book with the prologue, JSOC was actually conducting a Europe-wide loose nukes exercise out of sort of a remote airbase in Tezar, Hungary. And also, to continue with this theme, when it became clear that the United States was going to go to war in Afghanistan, the response of JSOC's commander at the time, Major General Del Daly, was to move this sort of massive headquarters not to a country bordering Afghanistan, not to a Northern Alliance foothold in Afghanistan, but to Masira Island off the coast of Oman. He had his reasons for doing that. He was also sharply criticized by some people for putting the organization somewhere where there was very little chance of them gaining any situational awareness of what was actually happening in Afghanistan. At the end of the initial campaign to topple the Taliban, in which JSOC played a sort of a hitherto barely revealed role, but frankly not the critical roles that the Central Intelligence Agency and Army Special Forces played, not to mention the U.S. air power. But while the al-Qaida leadership was still at large, largely in the mountains of Afghanistan and Pakistan, it became clear that Del Daly, the JSOC commander, actually was keen to get back to the States and move the bulk of his force back there. To some in his headquarters, it seemed that he wanted to resume the JRX training schedule as quickly as possible, rather than prioritizing the hunt for the al-Qaida leadership. Which brings me to my next theme, which is that individuals matter. I'm not an academic historian, and I know that there is a school of thought in the academy that it's large movements that determine history, not individuals. I just frankly disagree. Individuals do matter. Individuals do make a difference. The choice of one person versus another to lead an organization can make a huge difference into the role that organization plays and whether or not and how it leaves its mark on history. I think that's certainly the case with JSOC. Since September 11th, 2001, JSOC has transformed itself from the organization I've just described, sort of a rather unwieldy organization focused on no-notice missions of vital importance but short duration, into an organization that's able to run simultaneous campaigns in multiple theaters 24/7, 365 days a year. But that didn't happen automatically. It required a new leader, then Major General Stan McChrystal, who took command of JSOC in October 2003, so roughly 6 months after the invasion of Iraq. It was he who had the vision, the ambition, and the force of personality to make that happen. Obviously, he had a lot of help, but and he couldn't have done it without the extraordinary subordinates that he had and the extraordinary talents nested inside of the special mission units. And I describe how he did that in some detail in the book. And another theme here is the theme of hostage rescue versus manhunting as counterterrorism rubric or modus operandi. JSOC was formed for hostage rescue. But as I said, to my knowledge, it didn't do a single counterterrorism hostage rescue during the first 2 decades of its existence. There's a couple of small asterisks there. Certainly, there were a number of occasions where JSOC personnel advised other countries' security forces on hostage rescue, and in the opening minutes of the invasion of Panama in December 1989, Delta Force rescued a U.S. prisoner, Kurt Muse, from a jail where Panamanian security forces were holding him. But I don't count that as a counterterrorism mission. That was a mission conducted against the security forces of a nation state. Instead of counterterrorism, as I mentioned, three types of activities dominated. One were the big quasi-conventional raids, as I described, Grenada, Panama, and in fact there was one planned but never executed against Suriname, of all places. Counter weapons of mass destruction missions, often linked into these large raid type scenarios. There was a particular interest in Libya's Tarhuna complex for some years. And then the third was manhunting, which, like the others, was something JSOC fell into rather than something for which it was originally designed. Manhunts real-world manhunts that JSOC conducted included the search for Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega in the days after the invasion of Panama, which ended with him seeking shelter with the papal nuncio. The hunt for Mohammed Farah Aidid, Somali warlord that a JSOC task force chased with no success in the fall of 1993. Of course, that particular operation is best remembered for the strategically catastrophic raid that went bad on October the 2nd, 3rd, 1993, later memorialized in the book and the movie Black Hawk Down by Mark Bowden, in which 18 U.S. service members lost their lives. And then the other single individual manhunt that is well known from that period was the hunt for Pablo Escobar, which differed from the others in that while it involved very skilled U.S. technologies and users of those technologies from very secret units, it was usually just a handful of Delta or Team 6 operators on the ground, again advising Colombian security forces. That operation ended successfully at the end of 1993 with the death of Pablo Escobar. I would argue that it was those latter missions rather than the WMD hunts and the big raids that would actually form the template, or at least the basis, of JSOC's activities over the past 12 years. Nowhere more so than in its campaign against Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's al-Qaeda in Iraq organization during the Iraq War. That campaign involved far more resources of all types than any of the aforementioned manhunts, but it built on the same principles and incorporated lessons learned from those earlier missions. For one thing, it wasn't just one manhunt aimed at the leader of the organization, but rather hundreds of manhunts targeting the mid-level leadership. JSOC had to build its own network incorporating the various intelligence agencies so that it could raid an al-Qaeda in Iraq safe house or a mid-level al-Qaeda in Iraq leader's compound, interrogate individuals there immediately, seize all their digital devices and anything else of intelligence value, and then turn that material into actionable intelligence within hours rather than the days or weeks or months that it had taken previously, in order to launch another raid that night. This campaign had two operational benefits. One was that it gutted al-Qaeda in Iraq's leadership ranks. JSOC was essentially in a race trying to strip away al-Qaeda in Iraq's experience and battlefield savvy faster than it could be replaced. The second benefit was that eventually, as we know, it led to the death of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. A third potential benefit did not accrue to the United States, however, and that is the potential public relations benefit, or if you want to put it in sort of military terms, propaganda or information operations. JSOC had by then become the nation's main effort in the various campaigns that were grouped under the term global war on terror. And that is, but the American public knew nothing or next to nothing about its achievements. And that is because the US government has always cloaked JSOC in a blanket of secrecy. Now, this might have made more sense when JSOC was a little more than a few hundred folk in the pre-digital age, when the pager was considered a high technology information device, and when JSOC was a niche organization operating on the fringes of the US military scene. To me, it made a lot less sense by the 21st century, when those under JSOC's command numbered in the thousands, with tens of thousands of alumni, and when JSOC had taken on the lead role against al-Qaeda and its affiliates. The result of this was that in the dark days of 2006, 2007, when the US news media were dominated by the sort of the drip, drip, drip of depressing news from Iraq, one massive IED after another, soldier after soldier, service member after service member coming home in flag-draped coffins. The one organization that was achieving dramatic success against the enemy was the one organization that the American public weren't allowed to know about. Imagine if during World War II, the US public hadn't been told anything about Patton's Third Army slicing through German lines in Europe. For JSOC, I would argue secrecy had become an end in itself rather than a means to an end. I'm not going to bore you with, as I said, with all of the iterations of what happened in the post-9/11 era, but clearly the most high-profile mission, and one could argue from a sort of the long arc of history, the end point of the JSOC narrative arc was, at least for the first 30-plus years, was the raid on Abbottabad that killed Osama bin Laden. And I think it highlights what JSOC had become by then. It was a mission that didn't go perfectly. As we know, one of the stealth helicopters had to crash land by bin Laden's compound. But the countless rehearsals that had been conducted meant that the operators had the confidence and the savvy, the tactical expertise to immediately adapt, not let that screw up the operation in any way. What I think is almost more notable for the purposes of this talk is that JSOC launched a dozen other operations around the planet that night. These were the sort of operations that in the early days of the organization, and I'm talking about the first 15, 20 years, operators would train for and wish for their entire careers and never get to conduct one. JSOC had conducted a dozen in one night at the same time as they were conducting the most, important special operations mission in recent American history. The extraordinary, as I note in the book, had become routine. In Iraq, meanwhile, JSOC had knocked al-Qaeda in Iraq back on its heels, but it never destroyed it. As we now know, that organization morphed into the Islamic State, many times more powerful and threatening to Western interests, arguably, than al-Qaeda in Iraq ever was. And now JSOC is back in Iraq, in Iraqi Kurdistan, to be precise, conducting a targeting campaign against Islamic State leadership, which raises a couple of questions that I'd like to leave you with, a couple of issues. JSOC has for a long time been, I would argue, the tactically supreme combat organization in the world, certainly for its sort of missions. But even the most brilliant tactical organization needs to be optimized, nested within a sound strategic approach for its usefulness to be maximized. Even though JSOC performed superbly, achieving tactical and arguably operational success, it remains unclear that a reliance on a brilliant tactical organization alone can achieve strategic success. As Sun Tzu informs us, tactics without strategy is the noise before defeat. With that in mind, I would say that it's incumbent on policymakers and on us as the voters and taxpayers of the United States to ensure that, having built this perfect hammer called Joint Special Operations Command, the nation resists the temptation to see every intractable foreign policy problem as a nail. I will end it there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you for your patience.
All right, as we take questions, we have a microphone. I will designate who gets to speak, and I would ask you, please, we got enough folks here, we'd like to get all the questions answered if possible. Please resist the temptation to give speeches from the floor. If I don't hear a question mark at the end of the second sentence in your dissertation, I will ask you to sit down. So, who has the first question? Yes, ma'am. Right here. Use the microphone.
What impact did the departure of McChrystal have on JSOC?
I would argue not nearly as much as his impact as his arrival had. The officer who took over from Stan McChrystal was then Vice Admiral Bill McRaven, and he had been a deputy to McChrystal in the organization, and he essentially continued McChrystal's path of flattening the organization as much as possible, and building a network that extended far outside of the military members of the sort of the JSOC, typical JSOC task forces. So I think McChrystal had basically placed JSOC on a path that McRaven kept it on, and some people would say, maybe even improved.
You still have a question?
I can.
Okay, yeah.
I was
Okay.
going to wait, Steve, but anyways. Hi, Gary Sargent. I'm a retired Army SF guy by trade, but I am not ever was or had anything to do with JSOC. My question really is the sort of defining difference between JSOC and what you get with standard white special forces and sort of the success early on in Afghanistan for the 5th Group guys that were there, and then how that has morphed into sort of, my opinion, a bad strategy of working, whack-a-mole thing.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and it's an important issue. It's not one that I really delved into in the book because the book is a history of JSOC, but it's one that I've written about before in articles and may do again, because I don't think enough attention is paid to this. For the benefit of those of you who aren't completely familiar with the U.S. Special Operations Forces, they are roughly divided between direct action forces, that is, forces that are whose primary mission is sort of the JSOC-like sort of hunting, capturing, killing folks, and indirect action forces who work by, with, and through host nation militaries or guerrilla forces. And the sort of the preeminent exponents of indirect action approach are Army Special Forces, colloquially known sometimes as the Green Berets. It was very interesting to me, and I could talk for an entire hour about this. I'm going to try to keep this brief, that even though policymakers kept telling us in the decade and a half almost after 9/11 that the routes out for U.S. forces out of Afghanistan and out of Iraq was the creation of competent Afghan and Iraqi security forces that could hold their own against the insurgent threats and the terrorist threats that they faced, that the force that had been designed, created specifically to train host nation security forces was not, which is Army Special Forces, was not put in charge of that effort. And I think there's some push and pull there. I think some of that was directed from above, and I think some of it was some of the leadership figures in the so-called White SOF, the Indirect Action Special Operations Forces. They're not all indirect action. The rest of the Navy SEALs who aren't in SEAL Team 6 are direct action forces largely as well. White generally means acknowledged, not a classified unit. But the SF guys, civil affairs, psychological operations, all of those forces, I think, in a way took themselves, especially Army SF, out of the indirect action business, and
Because of the leadership that was all coming out of that other organization.
yeah, I think there's some truth to that. Somebody could write a PhD on how that happened, but in the end, they ended up training oftentimes only Iraqi or Afghan counterterrorism JSOC-like forces, as opposed to the wider militaries. So I think it's a very important issue.
Let's get right here. Sorry, we only have one mic this time. Rachel's doing double duty, both aisles.
Hi, George Nicholson, over 45 years in SOF, including with the stand-up JSOC, going back working with Blue Light before that. One of the things, you've sort of alluded to it, but what I have seen is the increased effort, going back to General Schumacher, of breaking down the barriers between SOF and conventional forces. But again, what Stan McChrystal did, and in particular Mike Flynn did, of breaking down the barriers within the community that we've had between white SOF and black SOF. And there's still some animosity, I think, out there where you're dragging black SOF down to the level of white SOF, but on the other hand, the attitude within white SOF, you're sacrificing us for black SOF. In your research and everything else, did you see any kind of indicators of that, or how that's been improved by some of the initiatives that Stan McChrystal put in place?
And you're talking specifically about the relations between JSOC and non-JSOC special operations forces, not the conventional forces.
And what's happening with the relationship between conventional?
Well, yeah, I think, and I believe that McChrystal has written a little bit about this himself. When it comes to the conventional forces, the machine that he built in Iraq in particular started to sort of take on a life of its own when it came to that had an impact on and created friction with the conventional forces. First of all, it's human nature. Anytime you stand up an organization and say it's elite, you're essentially saying to the people in it, or they might at least infer that you're saying, hey, the folks in this organization are somehow better, more skilled, more capable, what have you, than you are. That requires a fair amount of diplomacy to get past just in and of that. I don't care what sort of an organization, whether you're talking about teachers, whether you're talking about, hey, authors, it doesn't matter, right? That nobody wants to be told you're not as good as these guys, or nobody wants to have that implied about them. So that's always been a challenge, and it's a challenge both between sort of the special mission units and and the non-special mission unit organizations. It's a challenge between all of special operations forces. I mean, just the very phrase special operations, special mission units. It means we're special, you're not. That's whoever.
It says it on your uniform.
Exactly right. Yeah. So that was probably. I'm sure some folks, if they could go back and change the terminology to something different, that they might have done so. What would happen in Iraq that created problems, and in Afghanistan, was, JSOC had a sort of a national, nationwide mission and remit to go after, al-Qaeda in Iraq, leaders and so forth and so on across Iraq. Same thing in Afghanistan, and so. And again, this gets to the secrecy issue. They'd plan this operation completely self-contained inside their own task force, hardly tell anybody else they were going to do it. And a so-called land-holding or land-owning battalion or brigade commander in the Army or the Marine Corps who had responsibility for security in a particular patch of Baghdad or a particular town in Iraq or Afghanistan would go to bed and things were sort of copacetic, and he'd wake up the next morning and there was a smoking hole in the middle of Main Street where JSOC had just conducted a raid. All the locals are up in arms, and he feels he's back to square one in his mission. That, as you can imagine, happening scores of times, created some friction. McChrystal, I think, belatedly realized that was a problem and took steps to mitigate it. Same thing with McRaven. But, so long as you don't have a completely unified chain of command in country, which was really lacking, then those things are going to happen. And it's debatable as to the cost-benefit analysis of that sort of action.
Let's get you, ma'am, and then you, ma'am.
Thank you. Elizabeth Clifford. I'm sorry I have no voice. If you were advising the next president, who will be a Republican, how to integrate JSOC's capabilities into a broader military strategy against terrorists, what would you say to him or her?
Well, I think we're all lucky that I am not advising any presidential candidates. So first of all, with the proviso that I'm a reporter and an author, so it's not my job, and I'm sort of not going to advocate particular policies. However, I think it makes sense to always, whenever you're trying to craft a strategy, figure out what your end state is, your desired end state is, first of all. Instead of saying, we have this problem, we have these guys, let's put these guys on this problem right now. Okay, well, what are the second and third order effects of that? Why not take a step back, take a deep breath and say, how do we want this situation to end? What do we want the end state to be? And then walk it back. How would we get to there? In other words, construct a plan, chronologically backwards, if you like, and then decide whether you have the means to make that happen. If you are not willing to commit the means to reach your desired ends, then you have to get less ambitious about the ends that you desire. I mean, and then you have to fit JSOC in. Then JSOC has developed, as I discussed, a wide range of capabilities that go far beyond what it was originally created to do, and a lot of those capabilities, no doubt, would have a place in many of the potential strategies that policymakers would arrive at. My point is that think very hard before you make JSOC the strategy.
You, sir, and then you next.
Hi, Dave Price, retired journalist and educator. Sean, your book is history, but I'd like to go a little bit forward. You mentioned, and we all know the differences between al-Qaeda and ISIS. How do you see the way ISIS is behaving and moving Does that have a shaping on how and what JSOC should be doing?
Well, I mean, there are some obvious differences. Al-Qaida is a land-owning organization. Al-Qaida holds territory. I mean, it calls itself the Islamic State, and it's created a state-like, coherent patch of ground.
It is a nation state,
yeah.
no matter what people are telling you.
So, that gives you sort of pluses and minuses. It's hard to run a nation state, or a nation state-like entity without having fixed targets. So, at some point it'll become a more target-rich environment than hunting Al-Qaida in Iraq, who are literally hiding, right? Again, this gets back to a much larger question of what strategy should be against the Islamic State. I'm not here to tell you what it should be. I'm not an advocate for one strategy or another. But there are clear differences, between the, even from a tactical point of view, certainly an operational point of view, between going after one militarily and going after the other. But again, it would behoove anybody, who embarks on military action to have thought through the second and third order effects of that action and to have figured out exactly what they want to achieve at the end of it.
Right here.
Recently, there's been a push to kind of pull back the veil of secrecy associated with JSOC to increase oversight of the organization. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I got to tell you, having spent 3 years fairly arduously digging into it, they forgot to tell me that they were pulling the veil back. I suspect the veil is being pulled back maybe in an intra-government way, as opposed to for the public. I mean, that's, I'm happy to hear otherwise, but I've seen a couple of things happen, but I think they were probably more likely to be sort of individual decisions rather than changes in overall Pentagon or U.S. government policy. I mean, when he was the JSOC commander, then Lieutenant General Joe Votel appeared at a couple of conferences on speaking on panels or otherwise, which I certainly hadn't seen happen under any of his three immediate predecessors. So that occasionally that will happen. I don't think I've seen Tony Thomas, who's the current JSOC commander, do that. But you may know. I mean, I've finished the book, probably the heavy lifting on it in almost a year ago. So if something's happened in the more immediate past, I certainly keep my eyes and ears pretty open for it, and I haven't seen it.
All right. Yeah, Justin.
Justin Johnson with the Heritage Foundation. Could you talk a little bit about what lessons learned or operations or how JSOC does business that might be relevant? There's a lot of policymakers who are interested in pulling those types of lessons into the conventional force, into how the Pentagon works in general, just defense reform types of things. Are there lessons to be learned there, or are the missions just too completely different for it to be relevant?
Yeah. Well, Stan McChrystal has written 2 books basically based off of his experience as JSOC commander, and I think that there is a temptation certainly to take sort of cliches and and I'm not saying that that's all General McChrystal is doing, but there's a wider temptation to sort of take a few cliches and turn them into bromides for business. What JSOC did, it essentially flattened its organization so that it reduced the stovepipes of knowledge, and it invited stakeholders that were not part of the JSOC organization, under the inside the tent with it, so that McChrystal was able to get buy-in from organizations over which he had no control, but was able to get those organizations contributing to his effort and buying into his effort. So there's probably some lessons for other military organizations there. Certainly, as an aside, I would note that one of the dynamics that has occurred in the post 9/11 era is the extent to which the non-special mission unit organizations in JSOC have become more special mission unit-like, and the non-JSOC special operations forces have become more JSOC-like, and the non-special operations forces in the U.S. military have become more special ops-like. And that's a fairly gross oversimplification, but I think there's plenty of evidence that backs it up. So that I'm not sure I completely answered your question, but that's right.
Okay, I have one, and this is because Sean's my friend, so I got to ask him a tough question so nobody thinks I'm being wimpy on him. You have gotten a lot of blowback since the book came out from folks who said you said too much, that you may have given away tactics, techniques, and procedures, which, that's always debatable. But there are some names in the book. There are things that could put people at risk. I'm going to give you a chance to answer those critics.
Okay,
with that.
I appreciate that. First, just from the outset, as Steve mentioned in the introduction, I've spent 25 years writing about U.S. military, and a significant portion of that time in the years category has been spent embedded with U.S. forces in real world operations around the world, and in combat. I would never deliberately place any U.S. service member at risk. Despite my funny accent, I'm a U.S. citizen, and that wouldn't occur to me to do that. With regard to the names, which has become, to my surprise, more of an issue than the tactics, techniques, and procedures point. I'll say this: I'm a little disappointed that so many people, well, it's not so many, we're talking really about half a dozen, that I'm aware of, have criticized me for this without appearing to note that I actually went to some lengths in the book to keep a lot of names out of there. There were times when I didn't even ask for somebody's name because I knew I wasn't going to use it in the book. There were times when I was told a name but asked to keep it out of the book, and I did so. There were times when I made the decision without anybody asking me to do so to keep a name out of the book. There's examples where I use initials, where I use first name only, and so forth. So it's not as if I didn't think about this as an issue. U.S. Special Operations Command was certainly aware that I was working on this book for the entire time that I was working on it, and frankly never came to me with any concerns. Now, they didn't know whose names were going to be on it, but I tried to build a collaborative relationship with them early in the book's process, and I was politely rebuffed. I'm not quite sure. I'm not. I'm a reporter. I cover the government. I don't work for the government, and it's hard to write a history without using people's names, and I don't feel the need when writing about government officials to ask for their permission to write about them. That isn't, in my way, how the relationship between the press and the government should work.
All right.
See, can I make
Yeah.
a quick point? Not
Absolutely.
Sean, but
Get the mic.
I've heard all this criticism. I think that anybody who commented on extracts without reading the book, without looking at, the 20 pages of footnotes and endnotes that Sean has in the book, with the 12 pages of bibliographies, for instance, in my involvement on the Iranian hostage rescue mission, you can pick up Ron Lenahan's book, and by name, by service, by rank, by bed down location and everything, he names them all. You can go through all these other books. So if anybody wants to complain about what Sean has done, you can actually sit down and do a correlation matrix of all those. So I think it's sort of sanctimonious to say that he's out at all these people. Just my personal view.
Well, in the writer of Black Hawk Down and Guests of the Ayatollah, what else did he write? Chasing Pablo.
Killing Pablo, yeah.
All right. I would ask you to join me in thanking Sean for the book and the presentation.